This seems like a natural time to begin. The audience has spoken. It's time. Welcome everyone to the first Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, American Studies, and Ethnic Studies monthly colloquium of the fall 2024 semester. Thank you all so much for making time to be here. Last year, our three departments made a concerted effort to really focus on conversation and community building. And the kind of feedback and response we've gotten has been wonderful. As you can see, this packed room, we're so overjoyed to be able to bring our communities together. And today is extra special because this colloquium is co-sponsored as well by the Political Science Department. So thank you to Poli Sci for also co-sponsoring. Yes, that deserves a round of applause. We hope to continue to collaborate together across departments and across communities. So let's see, as always, our Women's Studies socials, you can get them here. If you haven't started following us, right now is a great time to do it. And if you do, you'll find out about all the great events that we have planned for this semester and this year. Speaking of which, our next colloquium is October 11th. And we'll be having a conversation between Dr. Mark Villegas of Franklin and Marshall and Ethan Caldwell of Ethnic Studies. And they're going to be talking about Black nerd culture and what happens when Black nerd culture meets Asian nerd culture. So there's something for everyone. It's going to be a great conversation. Okay, so I'm really happy to work with my colleagues in American Studies and Ethnic Studies this academic year to put on the colloquium. As I mentioned, Ethan Caldwell is one of those colleagues. He's not here today because he made a human. And so he's taking care of that little human. So we send him all of our good energy and joy. But he's here with us in spirit and helped us with the planning. Each of our departments kind of takes a lead for each colloquium. And today's event has really been spearheaded by the American Studies Department. And so it's my great joy to introduce Dr. Joyce Mariano from American Studies, who will then introduce our speakers for this book launch. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt that for 1 second and just say, if you brought trash, if you brought food and things that need to be thrown away, make sure to take it with you when you leave. I'm whispering because we're not supposed to have food in this room. And if we want to keep having food in this room, we have to take our trash with us. Okay, great. So today is the We Are Not American Still special issue of the American Quarterly. We're so excited to launch the issue, and I'm going to call Dr. Joyce Mariano up here to get it all going. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Edgen. What an honor to introduce the three editors of this special issue from the American Quarterly. It was the final special issue of the 10-year tenure of American Quarterly at Hawai'i. The first special issue that the editorial board ushered through was the award-winning issue co-edited by Kavika Tengan and Paul Lyons. And how beautiful we thought as we were soliciting proposals for the final special issue before American Quarterly moved to Notre Dame, we put out a special request to Lani Teves, who graciously and generously did the labor and brought on her two co-editors, who I'll introduce now. So first of all, we have Kamaoli Kuwata of Hawaii Nui Akea. And American Studies faculty and Hawaii State Poet Laureate Brandy Nalani McDougall. And Lani Teves of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. and they'll introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Mahalo. I just want to add that there's actually two other people on our editorial, Hui Hi'ile Hobart at Yale University and Miley Arvin at the University of Utah, who very regretfully couldn't be here today, but I want to acknowledge all the labor they also put into this. So just give a clap. Yeah. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, essayists who were a part of this special issue. I want to add that when I was asked to perhaps think about this special issue, my first thought was, who can I convince to do this with me? Because none of this kind of work I think should be done alone, especially when like taking on a task of trying to take stock of a decade of AQ in Hawaii. So I'm grateful that these folks wanted to do it. And then we also kind of wanted to like start some trouble. So hopefully we have achieved that. All right, so I'm just gonna go down the line. So Noelani Goodyear Kaopua, Professor of Indigenous Politics here at UH Manoa. Heoli Osorio, also a Professor of Indigenous Politics here. Makana Kushi, Brown University, but also an instructor at UH Hilo in the Gender Studies program and Hawaiian Studies. Tai Kavika Tengen, Professor of Ethnic Studies here. Kaimi Na'awau Kahikina, Indigenous Politics PhD candidate. Maheolani Ahia, I was going to say Women and Gender Studies. She's a certificate student as well as an English PhD candidate who's currently on a postdoc at a dissertation fellowship at Yale, so we're glad she could come. Cynthia Franklin, Professor of English. And Sam Ikehara, new professor in the Department of American Studies. Welcome. In addition to all of these people who are have written essays in the special issue, there are a number of other exciting scholars who also have essays in the issue that were not able to be here. The special issue is supposed to be like up online right now, but it's not. It's not our fault, but soon it will be. And as soon as it is, we'll be happy to spread the PDFs widely.
Yeah. Kalamai for that. Hopefully it'll be up shortly. Yeah, it was supposed to come out on Wednesday, so we're just a couple days delayed. Okay. So aloha mai kako. Really wonderful to see so many amazing people come out today to celebrate our special issue and all of the amazing ike e mana'o that these amazing folks contributed. So without further ado, I think what we'll do is maybe we could save our discussion as editors for after, but you guys could hear a little bit from each of the panelists here today who will share a little bit about their own contribution within the issue. I have to say, like on behalf of our editorial Hui, that we were just really blown away by everyone's contributions. Everyone really just brought it. Like, you know, we created the call for papers and submissions using, you know, We Are Not American still, because we felt it hadn't been really kind of discussed as deeply as it really should be within the American national scholarly context, and certainly not as widely as it should be within American studies as a field. And so we thought this would be a really important, you know, kind of foray into that to create this special issue, especially as the American Quarterly was leaving Hawaii, to really kind of emphasize that. And of course, it's inspired by our kumu, Haunani-Kay Trask, and a famous speech that she gave on the centennial of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1993 at Iolani Palace. So with that, I hand it over to our panelists to share a little bit about the works that they contributed to the theme, "We Are Not American Still." Okay, so we'll start off with Noelani Goodyear Kaupua. Mahalo.
Aloha kako. My piece is a co-authored essay with Jojo or Joaquin Peter and Kenneth Gofigan Cooper. And it's called Together We Are Stronger, Hawaiian and Micronesian Solidarities. I first met Jojo 10 years ago at a radio station after the Wake Up crew had told some really horrible joke online, and several of us showed up at the offices to protest and encourage them to do better. At the time, Ken was a PhD student here. Now he's a professor at the University of Guam. But that meeting set off a series of conversations about how Hawaiian and Micronesian communities here in Hawaii could better support one another. And so I want to spend most of my time just reading, because it's really important for me that Jojo's voice is here with us in the space. He has since passed on, but I think he would be really happy that this exists and is now out in the world. And a central question that we were addressing in the piece is, who are we in relation to each other? So these are Jojo's words. As an author, I need to specify my language to describe my existence and my own connection and disconnection with the lived experience of my fellow Micronesians and Indigenous Islanders. As a Chuukese person, I find it virtually impossible to articulate my Indigenous personal and cultural identity without having to confront the different, powerful, external forces that conveniently labeled and categorized my reality and lived experience in Hawaii today. Who am I and why am I here? Under what terms and conditions did I get here? And most important, what connections do I have here in Hawaii, and with whom must I foster those connections? On one level, I must understand these questions for my basic survival and the sake of my family. But perhaps more important, I must confront these issues for the survival of our growing community in Hawaii and begin to forge a common path that responsibly integrates the Indigenous cultural identity of our Chuukese and other Micronesian people with that of the Kanaka Maoli. Chuukese and other Micronesians in Hawaii are labeled as quote-unquote kofa citizens. That is, we arrived in Hawaii from the Federated States of Micronesia under the Compact of Free Association. From 1986, when my country effectively entered the KOFA Treaty with the US, KOFA citizens were designated as qualified aliens, legally present. Yet in 1996, when the US Congress enacted the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, my immigration status changed to quote unquote non-qualified alien. Nothing changed in my responsibility as a resident living in Hawaii, but a major US policy change now affects my access to healthcare safety net programs. KOFA citizens pay state and federal taxes but have no pathway to access safety net programs like Medicaid and food stamps. Despite these disparities, there is overwhelming misunderstanding in the public perception of Micronesians who bear the label of quote unquote KOFA migrants. The source of this discrimination is deeply rooted in an isolation policy established by the state and federal governments. And in turn, these state discourses contribute significantly to the perpetuation of racism and misunderstanding, creating a caricature of Micronesians in Hawaii. So Ken and I also responded, and what I'll read with the rest of my time is an excerpt from my section. The piece kind of combines these personal narratives with more, zoomed out sort of look at the larger historical and political conditions that bring us to this moment. How can Kanaka reach out to invite our Micronesian cousins into the struggle to assert our country's sovereignty, our ea Hawai'i, amid ongoing US occupation? How can we better see and hear and support each other? My people have not done enough to welcome Micronesian folks into spaces for dialogue, even though our movements are deeply embedded to teacher and master navigator Maupiailag of Satawal. The hokule of voyaging canoe occupied a special place in my understanding of our cultural resurgence. To Kanaka of my generation, youth growing up in the wake of the Hawaiian Renaissance, Nainoa Thompson and his revered teacher Papa Mau were like rock stars. The rebirth of Hawaiian voyaging would not have been possible without Papa Mau. The renewal of these practices did not only affect sailors, it infused Kanaka throughout the islands with pride, affirming the value of ancestral knowledge. We came to see our ancestors reflected to us on the surface of the deep blue ocean. My generation grew up being proud to be Hawaiian because of these cultural movements. But my experience growing up in post-Renaissance Hawaii is juxtaposed with Kathy Jetno Kitchener's experiences as a Marshallese youth, as expressed in her poem Lessons from Hawaii. She speaks of a turbulent adolescence bombarded by dehumanizing messages heard throughout her life. More of my people need to listen to Kathy. More of my people need to listen to Chuki's organizer Inocenta Saunkiku, who shared her heartbreak as a mother whose 12-year-old daughter brought home from school the pain inflicted by her teacher. She composed the poem I Am of Oceania to counter these messages, and she explains, I know many other Micronesian kids face different kinds of discrimination daily in their schools and neighborhoods. They're not seen as beautiful, talented, smart, and sacred, but rather nothing but trouble. I wanted to paint a different view. I wanted my daughter to know she is beautiful, wonderful, and special, and part of something much bigger, a greater call that we learn from our sky, our ocean, our lands, and environments to keep us strong. More of my people need to listen to the voice of Pohnpeian poet Carol Ann Carl. Writing of I Remember SciCap, she called for teaching, learning, and listening, nurturing against the structural violence that Pohnpeian Chukis and other Micronesian folks face in Hawaii. She writes, teach him that as the owner of a Chuki's Micronesian migrant identity, his existence as the descendant of a navigating society is the extensive culmination of a legacy of people crossing oceans to build relationships and connections. We can teach the young misled, but we cannot teach the young dead. As I listen to these women, I think about what we Kanaka can do to change the social and cultural conditions in which our Pohnpeian Chukis, Marshallese, and other Micronesian cousins sail during their journeys to and in Hawaii. And I will never forget the ways our oceanic brothers and sisters showed up for Kanaka Maoli on Mauna Kea in 2019. On August 16th, a Pan-Micronesian delegation traveled along Saddle Road and then turned onto Mauna Kea Access Road, which had become known as Keala Hulukupuna, the roadway of treasured elders. In that sacred place, our relatives from various Micronesian islands presented offerings and expressions of support to the kupuna, to the mauna, to the lāhui Hawaii, and they reminded everyone gathered of how the protection of Mauna Kea is also connected to the protection of Liteksan, Pagan, and Tinian from further imperialist military expansion. Such storms of imperialism and racism make Hawaiian waters turbulent and violent for our Micronesian cousins to navigate. When they look upon the surface of such waters, their reflections are distorted, obscuring the ancestors who look upon them from the ocean's depths. As our fellow islanders journey through and perhaps permanently anchor in our corner of the Pacific, we Kanaka must think about how we can help still those waters, because all our children need opportunities to see ancestral beauty reflected to us on our literal and figurative oceans. Mahalo.
Just keep going. Just follow that. Just go. Just kidding. Okay. Aloha mai kako.
Ovao no Jamaica Heoli Mali Kalani Osorio. So happy to see so many familiar faces and new friends in the crowd. You'll have to excuse me. I am on a number of opioids because I am in pain, so my brain isn't really working. So I took notes. We'll see what happens. 7 minutes. Let's go. I don't know what the name of my essay is called. I realized that while sitting here. Something about pu'uhonua and building places of freedom together. Those words all exist in the title. I'm gonna read a little bit from the abstract, so just you know what it's about. This essay weaves an upena of critical discourse to contribute to Kanaka Maoli abolitionist theory and praxis. Following the lead of Kumu Haunani-Kay Trask, I explore the intersection of the Black radical tradition and critical Hawaiian studies at the nexus of carcerality and multiple forms of Native and Black dispossessions. And specifically in the essay, I put in conversation Tiffany King's The Black Shoals with one of my kumu and uncle's work, Kumu Kanalu Young, and rethinking the Hawaiian past, and try to engage a conversation around the shoal and papa, the reef, to imagine and articulate how we might build places of freedom together beyond this idea of incommensurability. And I want to talk a little bit about how that came to be, because this essay was not a natural thing for me to write. It actually required a lot of shape shifting and growing and dealing with vulnerability and insecurity, and kind of working both in my own field, but also really trying to root this work in a field that is not my own and in Black studies, and in a way that was respectful and generative and intimate. And all of that had to do with Kumu Haunani. And so for those of you who don't know me, my father, Jonathan K. Kamakwiwa Ole Osorio, is a longtime Hawaiian professor. He's now a dean, but we try not to hold that against him at this university. When he entered the university as a student, he was a comrade of Kumu Kanalu Young's and a student of Kumu Haunani-Kay Trask and Nulikala Kame'elehiwa. Kanalu Young and my father then became colleagues of these brilliant women. And so by virtue of being my father's daughter, these women became my aunties and my teacher. Although this is important to say, I had never had the privilege of actually enrolling in either of their two classes, but I've been a lifelong student to both of these women. This is really important to name because Kumu Trask did something really essential at the Center for Hawaiian Studies that I think is often overlooked, that I try to really center in this essay, which is that she really built a curriculum around Hawaiian sovereignty and imperialism and white supremacy that required students to look at Black struggles and understand Black history, in particular African-American history, but also Blackness and white supremacy in a global and internationalist sense. It required that these early students in Hawaiian studies, the first contemporary Hawaiian institution of higher learning, really, it required that these early students come to understand sovereignty through an understanding of white supremacy more broadly, and through the reading of actual Black thinkers and activists and movement leaders. And so she introduced to Hawaiians Frantz Fanon, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Angela Davis, I have a list because I'm drunk, Malcolm X, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, very important. Those of you, From a Native Daughter, Notes of a Native Son. Okay, cool. It's unfortunate that since Kumu Trask's retirement and then eventual passing, that approach has largely been abandoned. And this is not a critique of the Hawaiian Studies Center, but just an acknowledgement that she really carried that work in a way that no one else has really done since. And so I, as her niece and not so much official student, was really interested in that question of what would it mean if we return to this study through an actual intimate study of Black thought and the Black radical tradition. And so I did what my Kanaka Black cousins told me to do, folks like Joy Enomoto and Pualani Warren, who reminded us to go back to Po, right? To go back to the darkness and the Kumulipo, our elder sibling, the beginning of our life here in the Pacific and in Hawaii. And one of the really important things that Warren and Enomoto both do is that they remind us that because we come from darkness and because we come from blackness, that establishes a particular kind of pilina with blackness in the Pacific, something that Hawaiians in particular need to contend with in this contemporary moment where anti-blackness is rampant in the Native Hawaiian community. I'm not afraid to say that. That might make people feel uncomfortable, whatever. It's the truth. And so their work really pushes us to contend really with that question. And so then I went back to my own work and my own research. And I spent 2021, Malia could correct this. I don't know what year this was, but 2021 or 2022, I spent the year researching pu'uhonua, which are Hawaiian institutions and places of refuge and sanctuary. And of course, there was a pu'uhonua on Mauna Kea in 2019 that many of us participated in and established together. And there have been pu'uhonua, contemporary pu'uhonua before that in Makua, in Waimanalo, in Wai'anae. But there's also this older historical tradition of creating refuge. And originally I was really just trying to write a mo'olelo about places of refuge from a Hawaiian perspective, what that might mean, and have to relate to an abolitionist tradition, how we might have like a pretty surface level conversation about sanctuary and refuge. And as I continued to write and rewrite this essay, it became really clear that that wasn't enough, that I actually had to go back to the books. I had to like bury myself in a field that, again, I was like not very comfortable in, because the tradition, the academic tradition that I was raised in, even as like an interdisciplinary student at Stanford, it really did see African American studies and Black studies as quite distinct from Indigenous studies. And so if we read Black authors and Black thinkers, we read them separately from Indigenous authors and Indigenous thinkers. And we thought of Black folks as different than Indigenous folks. So there were all these things I had to like overcome and return to in writing this essay. And I guess in the end, I'll say a couple more things about this. In the end, this was really, really important to me that I take that intellectual risk and even like personal risk to put myself out there in these ways, because I believe through writing this, I came to believe this even more, but I truly believe that both if we come from darkness, and we do, and if so many of our brilliant contemporary Kanaka scholars today have benefited tremendously from Black studies and Black thought and Black radicalism, which we have, then the things we produce today as radical Kanaka are a part of that genealogy too. And there's a need for reestablishing that pilina and that reverence. And so, as Kumu Haunani instructed, I turned in this essay to the question of Kanaka liberation with a commitment to the pilina between these struggles. And, I added and returned to my reading list. I read everything Chuck Lawrence III ever published, literally everything. I started reading more of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, more of Robin D.G. Kelley, more of Miriam Kaba, Octavia Butler, Joy Enomoto, Pualani Warren, Patrice Cullors, and King. And each time I read something else, I was led to somewhere else, and it felt like falling in love as a student again. The last thing I want to say about this piece is I actually want to read a part of it that didn't make it to the final draft, but was really important. And for those of you who are writers, you know that like there are things you have to write to get to the final that never make it into the final. And the ending just took a turn, mostly because the piece became less about Haunani and more about bringing into conversation Black thinkers that I was thinking beside and other Kanaka thinkers. But I want to read this because it's relevant to the issue. And I want to remind us that this is what I tell my daughter, like we can do hard things. We can do scary things. And when I think about that speech, we are not American. I never saw Haunani as a young person. I never saw Haunani to be the kind of person who was scared or nervous. But as someone who gets up on stage a lot and like says challenging things, like it is scary and it is isolating. And you have to be vulnerable to do these things. And so I just want to push us to like integrate that method into our work more. And I want to push us to pay really close attention to who's doing that and make sure we protect them better. Okay, so I'll read this last bit and I'll shut up. Okay. On January 17th, 1993, Haunani-Kay Trask proclaimed, "We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be American." On that day, from the Iolani Palace bandstand, she made a statement that was both factual and aspirational. She was correct then, as she is now, that by legal standards, Kanaka Oiwi were not and are not Americans. She was correct that rather than America's 50th state, Hawaii continues to be an internationally recognized country under occupation of the United States military. But in addition to the statement of fact was a powerful aspirational prophecy. Her declaration that we are not American was a plea. At 3 years old, I sat upon my father's shoulders and I watched her say those words. I felt the power of my kupuna rising from the aina and into me. And for the rest of my life, I, like so many others, have dreamed of the world she saw from her stage. A world where we not only have our government and our land, but more importantly, a world where we have each other, the teachings of our kupuna, and our commitments and solidarities to our comrades. If we remember her wanana as aspirational, as a prophecy yet to be realized, then we are empowered in the now to make it so. We are not American means we will refuse to maintain and glorify the institutions that have been built to benefit the few at the expense of the great. It means we will not consent to the desecration of any aina or any peoples, Hawaii, West Papua, Palestine. We are not American means we will live as our kupuna instructed and build societies founded on pono, balance, and generosity of heart and spirit. We are not American as a dream we are fighting our way back to. The call awaits a response that has not yet been fulfilled. Say it in your heart. Say it in your sleep. We are not American. We will die as Hawaiians. We will never be American. Let us make it so. Amama Uanoa.
That was so amazing. Speaking of being nervous, I'm just so blown away to be sitting up here with people whose books and essays and speeches inspired me to even go to graduate school when I started college as a first-generation college student. Then people whose works I was so excited to put on my own syllabi when I started my doctoral training, which I just finished in May. So yeah. So I just finished my PhD in American Studies, but I'm trained mostly as a historian, and my contribution to the special issue is an essay about homesteading in Hawaii, specifically in the territory of Hawaii, the fake state that preceded this fake state of Hawaii, before the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1920. So growing up here in Hawaii, when I heard homesteading, I always automatically thought of Hawaiian homesteading. But 110, 115, 120 years ago, homesteading was synonymous with a white supremacist vision of homesteading. So the piece analyzes a 1912 hearing held by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Walter Fisher, to determine why homesteading in Hawaii was failing. The piece has this long title: "Settler Homesteading, Hawaiian Homesteading, and the Failure of Americanization in Early Territorial Hawaii." So I was really interested in this idea of homesteading as synonymous with Americanization in the early 20th century in Hawaii, and to set that up as a failure. The US government at the time sees homesteading as a solution to two big problems in the territory of Hawaii: what they see as too much empty land. So in this time, the territory of Hawaii had stolen so much land from Hawaii's people, but in the kind of US vision of things, that was public land, and public land that was unsettled in the American settler colonial vision was a problem. the hope of the Secretary of Interior, in his own words, was to bring the land to the people of America. The second big problem at the time was a large non-white population. So the idea that there were too many Asians in Hawaii was the second problem that homesteading was trying to fix, again, from the US federal government standpoint. So homesteading was achieving this goal of Americanization meaning the peopling of the land with whiteness. So it instituted in the 1910s all these white homesteading projects. They were bringing white families who were themselves settler colonists on the continent to Hawaii to try and farm. They had this very racialized and gendered vision also of white reproduction. The idea is that they could grossly dilute the brownness of Hawaii by having these white couples come to Hawaii on cheap homestead lands and farm. Well, it turned out that those white farmers were not as productive or as reproductive as the US federal government had hoped. Most of the people who took advantage of this program came to Hawaii to farm and to reproduce, didn't do that. They came here for a few years and then went back to the continent. So the Secretary of the Interior comes to Hawaii to investigate why homesteading is failing. So the piece is an analysis of this hearing that the Secretary of the Interior holds to figure that out. And he's mostly coming to Hawaii with the intention of listening to the sugar planter class and listening to those sort of failures of white homesteading to figure out what's happening. But two Kanaka, two Native Hawaiians, come to the hearing and try to make space to advocate for Hawaiian homesteading in that gap. They thought, who actually is super apt to produce and reproduce on Hawaiian land? Hawaiian people, wouldn't you guess? So Kuhio is one of them, Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana Ole, and another one is this person, Charles Kahiliaolani Notley, who is a New Pepa guy, who also happens to be my kupuna. I'm a direct descendant of him, so that was exciting and cool. And they are advocating both for Hawaiians to get on the land, but in such different visions. Kuhio is this figure that seems maybe incomprehensible to us, in that he was a Hawaiian who was arguing that Hawaiians should be homesteaders because they were capable agents of Americanization. The more Hawaiians on the land, he argued, the less of the land is occupied by Asian people. And Kawanui has written about this a little bit in Hawaiian Blood. I think it's like a few pages in the third chapter of that book where she phrases it as Kuhio having seized upon the idea of Native rehabilitation as anti-Asian remedy. So that's Kuhio's kind of view, his strategy, I guess you would call it. Kahiliaolani, on the other hand, advocated for homesteading as the right of Hawaiian people and kind of flips the script on the typical racial triangulation of Hawaii. So Kuhio is following the classic Asian perpetual foreigner, scare quotes on all of these things, white pioneer, and Native person who needs to be rehabilitated. Kahiliaolani flips the script and says, actually, the people who were super foreign to Hawaii are white people. These are the people who weren't apt to be farming. These are people who are instead foreign to Hawaii. And he doesn't say a whole lot about Asian migrants and Asian farming, but his broader politics as a part of the Hawaiian Home Rule Party in the earlier territorial period can be further explored to think about his position on that. I came to do this research because I was looking into this kupuna of mine, and there's this newspaper article that has a picture of him. And he, there's the pullout in the newspaper that's like a quote that's in larger text, says, "Give all the land back to the Hawaiians," and it's like a picture of him, but the newspaper, it's an English language newspaper, is actually making out like him to be ridiculous. Like the story is like, whoa, this crazy guy is saying give all the land back to the Hawaiians. But I was really interested in what that whole thing was about. So points of the piece are largely examining a diversity of political thought in the Home Rule Party and in early territorial Hawaiian political leadership, the home rulers, made a lot of concessions. And actually, by this time, Kuhio is not a home ruler anymore. But they're perhaps in the popular understanding of the territorial period is an idea that, this wasn't a big time of Hawaiian activism and that Hawaiian political leaders were mostly playing into this narrative of pro-Americanization against Asian migration, but actually the piece is pointing to like we are not American as a longer tradition that exists also in this political space of the home rulers and electoral politics. So, and also just providing more historical context to the advocacy of the Hawaiian Homes Act, and for us to think today about homesteading not just as rehabilitation, but also us claiming our right, our not right, I don't like that word, but our belonging on Aina Hawai'i. Thank you.
Mahalo, and I want to just thank the editors who had to follow up with me many times. They literally took turns. I was asked originally to contribute a reflection piece on the first special issue, Pacific Currents, that Paul Lyons and I co-edited. And I was having some trouble, and then Maui kind of went ablaze. So I asked if I could just write about that. And in so doing, wanted to try to draw in some connections that I think we were trying to articulate with that first issue, try to point to some of the authors who were in that first issue as well. So I'll just read the first page of my reflection piece. And the title of it is E Ho'ikanani. On October 24th, 2023, nearly 200 Maui residents showed up at the Cameron Center in Wailuku to testify before the State Commission on Water Resource Management, which held its first meeting on the island since the deadly wildfires of August 8th burned over 1,000 acres in Kula and destroyed the town of Lahaina, killing over 100 people. Though climate change had something to do with the fires, the true culprits of the crime were the corporations that stole and the institutions that enabled the theft of streams in Maui Komohana, West Maui, and across the island since the mid-19th century, first for plantations, then for developments. Many Kanaka Oiwi and other supporters who had organized for the event wore one of two shirts, a red one emblazoned with Lahaina Strong, or a yellow one with the image of a mo'o, a lizard, next to the words E Ho'ikanani, let the beauty or glory return. Testifiers repeated both phrases as they called for the protection of streams and water resources whose histories and futures would determine the fate of Lahaina's indigenous and working class communities. In solidarity with friends and families on my home island of Maui, I use this reflective space to enact the sort of ho'i, or return, that Paul Lyons and I imagined might come from the confluence of the multiple au, currents of time, thought, weather, water, that we charted in 2015 as co-editors of Pacific Currents, the inaugural special issue of American Quarterly based in Hawaii and Oceania. Shortly after its publication, dear friends, mentors, and contributors to our special issue returned to the realm of the ancestors. Teresia Tewa, whose words feature prominently in our introduction, Paul Lyons, lead co-editor and imaginative force behind our collection, and Joaquin Jojo Peter, whose conversation on the complexities of Micronesian lives and struggles we included as an essay. I remember their words, like those of Haunani-Kay Trask, when I watched both children and elders in Maui stand in protection of their lands and vai, waters. They do this by repeating the refrain of the ancestors, one that calls for a future found in its past. Following their lead, I consider the connective possibilities of the call e ho'i kanani, and what forms of restorative relationalities might emerge from soils and streams that never have been and never will be American. We have 7 minutes. That title, E Hoi Kanani, comes from the mele that, if you've been watching any of the coverage of the organizing coming out of Lahaina, it was from an old name chant, the mele inoa for Manoa Noa. And there is a verse that talks about E Hoi Kanani Moku'ula, and really being now a kind of way of organizing this call, citing back to the New Pepa, in the sort of mo'okuoho consciousness that Kumunoinoi Silva has helped us understand, that was really put in the papers for future generations to look back to in order to then have a place to stand on, a place of connection. Moku'ula, the once center of political, spiritual power in Maui, small island that was surrounded by a 17-acre freshwater pond, home of Pi'ilani, and then his daughter in the 16th century deified as the Mo'okiha Wahine, the protective spirit from that place. Then later the home of Kauikeaoli, currently buried under a park, and had long been a space for community organizing and call for its restoration, because the restoration of that would mean reopening the streams and ending the water diversions that had dried the place up to begin with. Diversions that came from the plantations, particularly Pioneer Mill. They had dewatered Lahaina and left it the tinderbox that it was. So I cite this discussion in the struggles over Vai, in the struggles over water, in two of the meetings of the Water Commission that happened right in the aftermath, where the constant call, among other things, was also to restore Moku'ula, Mokuhinia, the waters that fed it. It's still an ongoing struggle, and even to this day, the governor is still failing to put back an expert in Hawaiian culture and water on the Water Commission. So there's a Water Commission meeting next week, so you can go give testimony there, or call the governor. Show up at his house. A lot of this too, I've been doing from afar. I haven't had the chance to go back to Maui. I'm not from Lahaina, but I have a lot of friends who were impacted. And so it was also a calling for me in a lot of ways to Hawaii to do that kind of return, as my research has gone in different places. But actually, as an undergraduate, my first research project was in Lahaina. So all of these things led me to kind of rethink about what it means to Hawaii in that sense. I've done other kinds of work on water cases in the past as a expert witness, although those weren't ever in the publication records that got necessarily prioritized in tenure reviews, but that's another discussion about tenure processes. So in any case, that's sort of how I wanted to kind of draw in, because of also really the solidarities that formed in Lahaina and across Maui and across the world in support of the land, in support of the waters, really, I think, embodying that kind of call that Paul and I had for the special issue, to see these coming together of people who are really caring for the lands and the waters, and taking the lead from the Aina and from the Vai itself, and understanding when the water is going to act on its own too, because again, once the fires destroyed the wells, the water started returning. It started reflooding the parking structures, the 505 Front Street. And so that itself embodying this kind of return that I think is inspiring for us to remember who's Mo'o, in the sense of descendants as well as descendants of Mo'o. We really are. Thank you.
Ooh, nerves, yeah. Aloha mai kako. My name is Ka'imina Awau Kahikina. I'm a PhD student, not a candidate yet, but just wanted to clarify that. I'm super honored to be here with my kumu and hoapapa to have this conversation with you folks. I was just thinking about Kumu Haunani-Kay's words, "We are not American." And I was thinking about how it was a really important point of inquiry for our lāhui at the time that it was said. You kind of can feel the audience when you're watching that video, and you can feel almost the shock, like, wow, you can say that, And from there, though, you can see like just this train moving, right, that she was on, and you just got to jump on the train or you can be left behind, kind of a thing. And from there, all of these conversations that have come about from the power of those words. So I'd like to think of my paper too as an important point of inquiry into the realm of mahu, and how we understand mahu today, right? As something, I think mahu we have been mystified and misunderstood, I think, for generations, and the word itself has been weaponized in many ways against mahu. And so my paper does a few things. I guess I'll start off with, I do a literature review in the beginning, and I look at queer politics and how queer politics, and especially LGBTQIA plus frameworks, are insufficient and at times inappropriate in relation to conversations about mahu. And I do my best to articulate it, still leaving room for conversation, still leaving room for solidarity and relationality. But I do try to make that distinction that mahu come from a Pacifica genealogy of thought and being, where and mahu, we have been mahu when the West was still figuring out what sexuality really was, right? What these discourses of sexuality really were. So that first section is talking about that. The second section goes into an analysis on the play Ho'oilina that was written by Maikane Akea Kahikina, to kind of articulate a Kanaka Maoli presence, right? And present, where mahu are integral to the reorganization of a family after the loss of their matriarch. And I liken this to the reorganization of our lāhui, right? And mahu having a presence in the reorganization of our lāhui in productive ways. And then the third part of the essay looks at mo'olelo, right? I think that part of unmooring ourselves from Western discourses on sexuality and gender in productive ways means that we have to really understand how our kupuna thought about, being. So I look at the Nupepa, and, with the help of my friend Kamalani Johnson, I'm like, brother, what mo'olelo should I look at? And so I got a few tips. Mahalo, Kamalani. I look at the mo'olelo of hi'iakai kapolio pele, lau ka'i'ie, and la'i'e kawai. And we're there. We're in these mo'olelo. And so I try to demystify without stripping away mahu from the opacity that makes us magical and beautiful, but to showcase that we are in mo'olelo, and that our presence in mo'olelo can help us understand belonging today in this present time. So if you just indulge me, I'm going to just read a little section. I'm quite nervous, so forgive me. I might skip over a word, so Okay, by peeling back the layers of settler colonial context, Morganson's work complicates the settler and native binary through a study of the power-laden conversations between native, queer of color, and queer white actors. Importantly, Morganson's study showcases the power of native critique in unsettling the processes of domination, absorption, and transcendence in a liberal, multicultural, non-native queer modernity through two-spirit activism. For Morganson, native queer modernity arises in relation to non-native queer modernity within these discrepant genealogies. I further argue that non-Native queer politics attaches itself to the heteronormative and colonial lens of Native sexuality by assigning queer to traditional modes of Indigenous relationality, example being two-spirit, mahu, in order to transcend the settler colonialism to which queer politics is native. This transcendence positions non-Indigenous queers as inheritors or kin to Indigenous peoples via sexual genealogies assumed to be shared in order to articulate a primordial queer belonging that can contest the hate espoused by the political community to which it seeks to belong. Indigenous relationality is only queer through the lens of heteronormativity. Thus, the notion of queer does not dismantle heteropatriarchy, it enables it. While Morganson's theorization of Native and non-Native queer modernity clarifies the development of queer politics in the context of settler colonialism, modernity as a framework for theorizing mahui, which is a word that has arisen recently, is insufficient as it is prefigured by humanist assumptions. Tiffany Lothabo King, via the usage of autopoiesis, I have a hard time saying that word, in her critical Black cartographic analysis of 18th century colonial cartography, reveals the unstable process of settler self-actualization through constructs of the human mapped through Black and Indigenous death. Through King's methodological intervention of shoaling, influx, unstable, chaotic, Black fugivity, and Indigenous resistance unsettle notions of the modern human and illuminate them as a map in a perpetual state of autopoiesis. Thinking about Black fugivity and Indigenous resistance makes viable the possible avenues of rupture and opacity beyond the prefigurable. Native queer modernity, in Morganson's words, arises discrepantly from non-Native queer modernities precisely when they engage in power-laden conversations. I aim to complicate the implications of this notion. When Native queer peoples engage in power-laden conversations with modernity, we contest the genealogy of settlerism through the intellectual geographies of our ancestors that account for every living thing, human or other than human. This Indigenous present arises in relation to our communities first. When we have conversations with non-Natives about being, we have already had those conversations with our people. Our power comes from the ground that embraces the bones of our ancestors, and our conversations happen genealogically. We're not offering a discrepant account of the modern queer. We are building our halau and erecting the kuahu, chanting our belonging from the entrance. Liberation does not come prefigured, and neither does belonging. And as I stare at the grand stage of settler belonging, embellished with mosaics of figures brown and beautiful, I whisper Audre Lorde's famous prose. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's error. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own dance, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So, the essay, is titled No Mahui Aloha. And mahui is a word that has come up recently, and it's really exciting to see how it has kind of gathered community around mahu being, right? So I would say maybe like 4 or 5 years ago is when it started to really take root, and now we have like Coco Chandelier and who is just running with it, Mama, love her. But it's kind of the foundation for this paper because it acts like an epistemological plugin, right? Where for example, the LGBTQIA plus umbrella is at times insufficient and frameworks. The mahui has arisen as a really important orientation, mo'oku ohau consciousness kind things, but an orientation to our kupuna, to our mo'oku ohau. And it also, something that I've talked with my kani about, it also helps us recognize that there are still members of our lāhui who would rather not see mahu at any aha, right? And that's something we need to really think about, unmooring ourselves from the heteropatriarchy that informs that kind of thought process. We still have a lot of work to do, right? So while Haunani's work helped me sort of orient myself to to this, it just helps me recognize that there's just so much more work to be done within our lāhui. As a point of inquiry, it helped me think about that. But anyways, I'm kind of rambling now. Mahalo.
Aloha mai kākou o mahi alani ahia ko inoa. Hello, everyone. I'm Mahea, and first, I just want to say I'm so honored and pleased to be among such tremendous work. I can't wait till this volume comes out and I can start reading. Let me pull out my notes because I am just off of 20 hours of plane rides and layovers and arrived 2 hours ago. I'm really grateful to be sitting here with Cindy Franklin. We co-authored a piece called A Education, Letters from Hawaii to Palestine. And so I'm just going to have a few brief comments of insights that I came up with related to that. So first, Haunani-Kay Trask's famous phrase, "We are not American," causes a lot of angst as a diasporic Kanaka. So technically, I am American, born on Tonga lands in Los Angeles and raised on Ahashiman lands in Dana Point, California. And in fact, Haunani-Kay Trask herself was born on American lands. So this fact stands as a really awkward reminder of the tragic displacement of our Native peoples from our lands and a disruption of our kinships with our beloved Aina, our language, and our people. Like my father and his friends, many of the younger kids in the families of that generation who weren't the eldest to inherit the family home were oftentimes encouraged to go abroad and try and make a living somewhere else. Most of them thought they were going to go away and then they were going to make a fortune and come home, and most of them did not. And so, like my generation, we were born basically in exile. So others have left for university, for jobs. Many people here have, gone on to study outside and luckily were able to come home. But many of the people did not make it back this much. So in our piece, we have the building of pilina and solidarity between Palestine and Hawaii over a series of time in an event we call Decolonial November. So every November, we invite Palestinian scholars and artists to come and build relations with us. And it's not just about, a one-time kind of a thing. We literally have relations in conferences and signal threads. When the Maui fires happened, our Palestinian friends created an entire webinar to raise funds for Maui. And so we have this long-term relationship that's being built. And I was really fortunate in many of the times to spend real intimate time driving some of them around the island. And we really talked deeply about the differences between Palestinian and Kanaka diasporic living, because most of them are teaching in universities here in America. And so we talked deeply about the pain and regret and resentment and helplessness of being so far away from our lands, especially during tragedies. One thing I want to point out is that we are really careful not to conflate our experiences, right? As the Mana statement said, there's a much more tender experience of colonialism and imperialism here in Hawaii than our Palestinian kin are experiencing. To the point that Palestinians live in a diaspora where most of them have no right of return. So I personally can't even imagine not being able to come home to the family lands on the summertime, not be able to feel my feet sink into the sand or, climb barefoot through the rivers in Maui. Cindy and I began writing these different iterations of our piece on Palestine for the American Studies Association conference. And when we had done that ahead of time, we could not have ever imagined what would happen in the interim. To see the horrors of genocide before our eyes, to see our friends like Noor Judah, who I had shown around the Mauna. She came up and stayed in my tent for a couple days and really built solidarity over time, to hear that she lost 50 members of her family. Entire genealogies have been wiped out. And as the Kanaka, thinking of our genealogical remembrances, how can a whole family just be wiped out? And so these kinds of holding of each other through various different tragedies and building and holding on to the love that is taught, as Sarah Imud says, portals of grief. We find those moments of love with each other and we carry that. This Pilina building is really, to me, how we overcome this idea of living away from our land and building kinship and building solidarity with each other to walk ourselves through it. And so, you know, when I say I'm not American, it means I don't stand with America and its complicity in their war machine. It means I will never condone the white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, classist, anti-Indigenous, anti-Black experiment gone awry called America. So many of my Hana in post-Maui fires are still living day to day, trying to survive the very real effects of settler colonialism, military occupation, and the inhumane attitudes of entitlement of tourists and those who buy their dream vacation homes to continue to displace and maim our lands and lāhui. When I say I'm not American, it means I will not honor a flag that shows disrespect by flying above our Hawaiian flag that my great-great-grandparents helped to design. And finally, as a diasporic Kanaka dwelling on other Indigenous lands, as I'm again in the continent, in the cold of Connecticut, it is mine, it is ours collectively to carry this kuleana, to ally with each other against an insidious American imperialism until we're all free. He Hawai'iao, Eo Palestina.
So for the, it's really an honor to be here with everybody, and I can't wait to read these essays as well and to teach them. So for the past 2 weeks, I've been going through a big archive of photos from past students and faculty for Justice in Palestine at UH Colonial Novembers to prepare for our contribution to AQ's Beyond the Page website. And when I was doing so, I came across a 2022 photo of Sumaya Awad taken at Kaimana Beach, where we regularly bring our visitors to swim and share food and stories and to plot ways to support struggles for a free Hawaii and a free Palestine. So in this photo, Sumaya is holding up the same t-shirt that I'm wearing today that actually Kamali is wearing as well, which we had gifted her at our gathering. As she lifts up the shirt, the trade winds carry the words, "Say it in your hearts, say it when you sleep. We are not Americans," close to her chest. In preparing for today's launch, I've been thinking a lot about this image of Sumaya because it captures so much of what I think Mahe and I strive to do in our letters. Haunani's clarion call, delivered at Iolani Palace on January 17th, 1993, the 100-year marker of the overthrow of Hawaii, is of course one of anti-colonial resistance, a call to Kue to fight for Hawaiian independence. Her call is also, in ways that Heoli was talking about, staunchly internationalist, as she goes on to remind people, the United States of America is the most powerful imperialist country in the world. As Mahe and I discussed in our letters, Trask's internationalism included consistent support for Palestinian liberation from occupation and settler colonialism, and an insistence on connecting the Hawaiian and Palestinian struggles. And I can only imagine what she would say today as this genocide rages on, funded by the US. Sumaya, holding Haunani's words close to her own heart, in the company of students, faculty, and community organizers working to strengthen this solidarity through bonds of friendship, is, I believe, an important part of what it means to say, we are not American, and to refuse what Haunani called America as a death country. And here I will take the liberty of adding Israel to that description. I've also been thinking about her call to say these words in her sleep. And I take this proclamation to be one that calls for collective dreaming. Because anti-colonial resistance is not enough, it must also be accompanied by a collective dreaming of what comes after. As a settler, it is not, of course, my place to determine that, but I do firmly believe that what I can participate in is the creation of communities of radical care that refuse colonial violence, that say no to a US imperialism that is international in reach. I believe that in this way, I can join with my Indigenous friends in saying we are not American. In my first letter to our readers, in introducing myself, this is how I put this. I write to you as a US citizen, as a settler, house owner in Haole, living for these past 30 years on Kanaka Maoli land, and as a state employed, as my child likes to remember me, tenured professor of English at the University of Hawaii. From these positions of privilege, each imbricated in ongoing histories of settlerism and racial capitalism, I have participated in movements led by Kanaka Maoli and Palestinians to resist colonialism and occupation and to bring into being decolonial presence and futures. Through my teaching and organizing, my particular interest for the last decade has been in nurturing bonds of friendship, solidarity, decolonial love from Hawaii to Palestine. This has been my way in my waking moments to say that I am not American, and through participating in collective acts of dreaming, to support those creating alternatives to U.S. empire, specifically as a settler state that occupies Hawaii and sustains the Zionist entity known as Israel. When people begin with the statement, I am humbled, is really often so performative and terrible. So I tend to shy away from that formulation, but I also feel like this is an occasion that calls for it. And I'm really humbled to be able to participate in saying we are not American through organizing with SFJP at UH, through writing letters with Mahea about this involvement as a form of education and of strengthening Polina from Hawaii to Palestine, and through being part of the AQ issue in this launch, where we can continue still to say together, we are not American as we resist US empire, including through the creation of community that takes as its foundation freedom and dignity for all people. Mahalo.
Aloha, my kako. So I'm really honored to be a part of this truly special, it is a truly special issue. And my contribution to it is entitled The Feel of Peace, Noise Pollution, and the Sovereignty of Wind. In this essay, I examine US military noise pollution in Hawaii and Okinawa, delving into how Hawaiian and Okinawan testimonials and poetics contest the US military's dominance of the air through historical and contemporary embodied relationships to wind. And so we were asked to reflect on the title of the special issue, and it brings up so much for me. I think about how many veterans I have in my family, how being proud to be an American was a given in my family. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized how complicated that was for my Okinawan grandfather, because identifying with America was a way for him to reject the Japanese racism he grew up with in Hawaii, in Japan, in Okinawa, that he experienced his whole life. And so something I reflect on in earlier drafts of this essay and in my book project more largely is that how he and many other Okinawans in Hawaii thought that Okinawa's relationship to Japan was just weighed down by too much violence, too much racism, and they really believed that the US represented something different for Okinawa. And so this was something he organized towards with local Okinawan community and the US military. And so he went to Okinawa as a part of US Cold War diplomacy efforts on a friendship mission. Sorry, I was thinking a lot about Paul going into this, and Paul Lyons is a thinker who taught me a lot about friendship. He writes a lot about friendship and American Pacificism. But anyway, the ethos of that entire trip was, we local Okinawans are American, and now you can be too, like Okinawans in Okinawa. And built into that, of course, was its naturalization and justification and celebration of statehood here, as violent as we all know it was and continues to be. And so once I was old enough to understand the politics of these trips home for him, I sat with the complexity of all of that, and how he had to navigate conditions I can never fully understand. But in that space of uncertainty, it was Haunani's work that offered me a lot of clarity. She wrote in From a Native Daughter that, quote, the ultimate injury is becoming strategically important in the game of superpower politics, end quote. And that insight enabled me to ask, Hawaii and Okinawa share this crucial injury, but what do they share beyond injury and the violence of occupation? Is there a space for there to be a shared we between Hawaii and Okinawa to declare that neither are American or America? And what would it take to heal this injury? And so that's really the question at the heart of my essay. And for the plaintiffs in the Okinawan noise pollution lawsuits that I write about, they testify it's the reclamation of air itself, the return of their sky. So one of the plaintiffs whose testimony I include in my essay, he's a teacher named Ikehara Nobunori, no relation. He testified that the return of the sky from the US military would be a means through which he could reclaim his very self. And so while Haunani strongly declared in this very same speech that sovereignty is not a feeling, it is government. What these testimonies brought up for me when I first read and translated them was just how deeply intimate US military occupation is. It inhabits people's very bodies and how they move through and experience the world, even within their own homes, as so many plaintiffs testified to how noise breaks through their soundproofed homes that have been soundproofed with money from the Japanese government. And so in an earlier version of this essay, I wrote that a shared we between Hawaii and Okinawa cannot be assumed as a given. And so this essay emerged out of my thoughts and hopes on how we pursue and earn a we that exists in solidarity with one another, that's not organized around injury and America. And so something I read about is just, Osprey crash in both Hawaii and Okinawa. Osprey Station in Okinawa have moved to Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Base. People in both places feel an acute fear and anxiety in the air itself. Parents in both places bring their concerns to the state and testify to the harm that they know all of this brings to their children. And these parallels exist in so many places that are subjected to US military occupation. But one thing that really stood out to me through my research were the Hawaiian and Okinawan kind of archival materials, and how these materials regarded their relationship to the wind, and how in both Hawaii and Okinawa, wind was an important expression and materialization of sovereignty. And so I'm thinking about Davida Ke Kahale Maile at a lāhui ea, saying the ea of the person or the people is wind. And I'm thinking about how in the Omoro Soshi, in the Ryukyu Kingdom, wind was celebrated as a manifestation of their kingdom's sovereignty. And so I read this past into the present through poetry, like by the Okinawan poet Nakazato Yugo and Randy Nalani McDougall, to think about people's relationship to the wind and what does the reclamation of air mean and what does that have to do with land. And so I wanted just to end by saying that I don't identify as American for all the reasons that have been stated, for all the violence that very identification has done to my family, and that America has inflicted in America and around the world. But when I went to Okinawa for the first time, my family there all regarded me as American. And I, of course, was not surprised at all by that. But it did feel super nasty. And I didn't bother to correct them. I know where it came from. And but I forced myself to sit in that discomfort and think about how, as a settler to Hawaii and diasporic to Okinawa, what does being located as American perhaps enable me to do that I couldn't do otherwise? And yesterday, for the first time, actually, I read this letter by the Black feminist poet, June Jordan. And in it, she so brazenly claims responsibility and claims Americanness for Israeli war crimes against Palestinian people because she believes it was her responsibility to do so. And I felt really grateful to encounter it before coming into this conversation because it left me a lot to think about with myself. And so I think about Haunani's call for a refusal of American identity and how it offers opportunities for all of us who are not Hawaiian to think about kuleana or sukubun, or the responsibility of how we choose to identify and how we can accept or create opportunities to be in solidarity and deepen our solidarity with one another. So thank you so much.
Mahalo nui loa to all of our contributors and mahalo for sharing all of your amazing work. Please give them a round of applause. We have an especially rich special issue that is awaiting you all to read, which hopefully it'll be out soon. Just keep checking. You can access it for free through the UH Manuel Library, either through Project Muse or EBSCO. So just keep checking until it's there. Keep checking. I wanted to say really quickly, because we are out of time, unfortunately. So we're going to have to forego a question and answer session. But I just wanted to point out and reflect that as you could hear from just a smaller, like a sampling of the contributions featured in the issue, that when we were envisioning a discussion of "We Are Not American Still" as the theme, we were also really interested in what's made possible by rejecting Americanness, right? And then also thinking about then how do we define who we are? And then opening that up to how these conversations, these discussions, these very elements of our identity are not just amongst our Kanaka Oiwi communities, but within all of the communities in Hawaii, whether they are descendants actually of non ethnically Hawaiian, but Hawaiian nationals that existed at the time of the overthrow, that lived here in Hawaii at that time, or whether you are people who are just like have come to Hawaii since then, but have decided and felt very strongly like, I would identify actually as more Hawaiian than I would American by virtue of being here, by virtue of understanding our histories, understanding, or being a part of our aina and all of that. So we wanted to really also open that up. And then what could come from those possibilities of rejection and then embracing who we are, right, as Hawaii. And I think, all of the amazing authors today really kind of shared all of that really glorious possibility. So mahalo nui loa for that. And as many folks said, I think, Haunani or kumu for many of us, well, for all of us actually, but some of us got to sit in her classroom and learn from her in person. But her legacy continues by virtue of the ways in which we're taking that forward. We're taking that really important thinking forward and moving with it and letting it blossom and bloom into so many different possibilities. Again, kalamai for not having time for question and answers. I just wanted to also add that this special issue, aside from featuring scholarship, also features poetry, hip hop, and some visual art from Hawaii. It includes photographs from Au'a and Nāwahi Pana o Ko'olaupoko by Kapulani Landgraf. It also includes poetry by Donovan Puhio Collips, Punahele, Liz Soto, Ihilani Lasconia, and Kauila Mahi, No Uruvilla, and myself. So please check that out as well. We are interested in making sure that creative work is also a part of the discussion. Of course, there's our kupuna, all of our kupuna in this room made no distinctions between creative arts and scholarly work. They're all intellectual, right? And so we thought it was really important to kind of dive into the theme of the issue as well. And then finally, just wanted to point out the images up here behind folks. The one on the right where you see Hawaii is not America. This I can thank Amber McClure, is Amber here? For sharing it with me through Instagram. And this is on the back side, on the street side of Cocoa Palms, okay, on Kauai. And then to the left there, this image is actually probably quite a few people might have seen this circulate on Instagram also, which is "We Are Not American" was projected onto the Capitol building. And then the image, I think it was projected on July 3rd, which happened to be when Haunani passed the same day. And it's taken from, of course, it wasn't legal to technically do this. So the photographers and the people who projected their identities are not going to be shared. And they weren't shared on Instagram either. And then, but as you can see, like there's a figure there, it might be difficult to see, but that's from behind Queen Liliuokalani's statue there. So unfortunately, they made that statue of her look at the Capitol building, but the artist who did this guerrilla projection here put "We Are Not American" on there so she could look at that instead. Very encouraged to go out and get some refreshments and then ask folks, talk story, discuss about what you heard today in lieu of the question and answer session. So mahalo, aloha.